And welcome back to another Hellenistic challenge when we answer a question using just the 7 traditional planets. Today the question is, will Vladimir Putin ever back down? He's suffered some reverses in the Ukraine over the past few weeks, but then just this past week he announced that he's going to send in more troops. He's even calling in reserves. People are fleeing the country so they don't get called up. And also he's been very involved in advising his generals and actually calling the play. So he's still very much committed to the war in the Ukraine. And so let's look at his chart and see what his chart can tell us about will Vladimir Putin ever back down. Now, this is a chart that is cannot give us quite as much information as we usually have, because notice the time is rated DD, which some astrologers call dirty data. The time that we have is just not accurate. As my little grandson is wont to say, it's infinity garbage. And so we're going to have to ignore the house placements. We're going to have to ignore the angles, and we're also going to have to ignore the moon, which on the day he was born was moving from Taurus to Gemini. But we'll find with the 6 remaining planets, there's still a treasure trove of information that we can mine. Now, we first look to his Libra Sun, and you think, why isn't he more cooperative? Why doesn't he want to get along well with others? Isn't that what Libra's all about? Well, Libra actually, the Sun in Libra is in its fall. You think about when the Sun goes into Libra every year in the Northern Hemisphere, it signals that we're going to have more darkness and light in the coming days. And so Libra seeks to partner. It's a very strong impulse for a Libra Sun. Just as we know we're going into the dark, we want to go with someone. We want a hand to clutch. And the partner in Putin's case has been Ukraine. You think historically they were, I read one commentator said it's almost like Putin was the abusive spouse and Ukraine was the wife who fled and developed her own independent life, and he's forcing her to come back to him. So that kind of dynamic is in play. You belong to me. You shouldn't go off and join NATO. You need to come back into the fold. Truly, that's what you want to do. So all of that energy is in this fallen Libra Sun. But notice he's pulling into the force field of that Sun 2 other very powerful planets. We see Mercury under the beams here, just 10 degrees, anything 15 degrees would make it still under the beams from the Sun. And so this Mercury, the advantage of having a Mercury so close to the Sun is it becomes a very supportive planet for the ego and what we want to do. We can use our thoughts, our communication, our intelligence to bring about what that Sun is driving us to do. So that's a very an advantage of having Mercury so close to the Sun. The disadvantage is that you lose some objectivity because you tend to have tunnel vision and only see what you want to see. And so also affecting this Libra Sun and Mercury is Saturn right here in the middle of it. And Saturn in Libra is exalted. So it's a very strong Saturn. And I have to admit, I'm not a huge fan of exalted planets. I have 2 in my chart, and they're kind of a mixed blessing. So while this Saturn in Libra is very good at promoting fairness and seeking that kind of beautiful life that a Libran wants, where everything is in its proper place and the world is moving along harmoniously, it tends to be very dependent on its own perception of what that is. Can be very judgmental. And so especially when the Sun has pulled Saturn, into its orbit so closely, this sense of what is good and real and true and right in this world is going to be very tied to Putin's ego. He's going to see what he wants to see and fight for what he believes is right without any object voice. And so you think this Libra stellium, who's in charge? Of course, that is Venus. And you think, well, Venus is in charge of the stellium, something that gets along, likes to get along, likes to connect. But notice where Venus is. It's in detriment in Scorpio. So Venus is used to not really getting what it wants all the time. It struggles to get what it wants, and it's kind of learned how to sacrifice. I would always say Venus and Scorpio are people who know how to kind of give up their immediate needs for a longer range goal, or give up their immediate needs to serve another. It's a very sacrificial energy. And also we see this Venus in Scorpio does not see the Libra stellium by aspect. They're in aversion to each other. So it's like these Libra planets are kind of cooking away here, almost like kids left home while the parent is out of town. And so they're kind of doing what they want to do. And Venus is kind of preoccupied with its own affairs and not really giving that Libra stellium the best advice. And so if we look at this Venus, we see that it's also a fixed sign opposite Jupiter. And it actually rules this Jupiter. And so let's take a moment here to think, oh, he's got both benefics in fixed signs. And so I would imagine over his long life, he has found that good things come to him when he stays very fixed in what he wants, and stays on his path. And we've certainly seen that to be the case with Putin. You know, he kind of sets his mind on what he wants to happen and digs himself in. And so by being fixed brings him good things. And let's look at this Jupiter a little more. It's not the strongest Jupiter. It's moving slowly. It doesn't have any special dignity in Taurus, and it's retrograde. And you think of Jupiter in Taurus as, you know, wanting to expand what we acquire, and especially Taurus land, and in Putin's case, you would see. But yeah, that expansive energy goes into kind of earthly things that we want to possess and have. And when planets are retrograde, I think the energy of that planet tends to be almost instinctual, something that we don't really think a lot about or process. It's just there. And so you see that Jupiter in Taurus, ruled by that Venus in opposition, they become kind of like a terrible twosome, because Venus does see Jupiter by aspect. It's they can work together more cooperatively, but in Putin's case, it's like, I'm going to expand, you know, I'm going to gather more territory, and Venus over here is saying, okay, let's make whatever sacrifices possible in order to achieve that. You know, Putin has said in the past, sanctions, I live with sanctions, bring them on. They don't really deter him from his path. And so you think, okay, so here's, you know, all the indicators here that he's not going to back down. What about this Mars in Sag? You know, it's a mutable sign, maybe a little more open to change. It's ruled by Jupiter. But if we look at, okay, who's in charge of that Sagittarian Mars, but this fixed Jupiter in Taurus, which is kind of bent on acquiring territories. And so we've got Jupiter and Mars, also that aversion. And so this Mars here is kind of operating by itself again. And, you know, you think about Mars in Sagittarius, very visionary, very truth oriented. And that Mars is kind of baked into a sextile with that Libra stellium. And notice that Libra is has a superior position in the stellium because they rise ahead of Mars and Sagittarius. And so this superior position stellium of the Sun, Saturn, and Mercury can harness Mars in order to bring about its goals. So I would say, in answer to our question, will Vladimir Putin ever back down? My best prediction would be no. I think he'll be knocked down before he backs down. Looking at the future, you know, it's always hard to predict. One thing I would watch is this Mercury. Remember, we said it's under the beams, not the strongest Mercury. It's with Saturn, the malefic. Notice when we shoot the ray of Mars into Libra, it falls at 26 degrees. And so notice that that Mercury is between the malefics. It has an enclosure. And like we talked about last week, how it's good to have a planet between Venus and Jupiter. In this case, it weakens the planet, it threatens the planet. to have the malefics on either side of it. And so there are rumors that he does have some neurological disorders, which would certainly be an afflicted Mercury. Of course, those are hard to prove. And because we don't know his birth time, we can't really say what houses are affected by Mercury being afflicted by Mars and Saturn. But I would just say kind of watch transits to that Mercury. I would imagine when we had our Saturn-Pluto conjunction in 2020, squaring it, that was a time that his kind of threat level, that sense of threat grew as Ukraine was approaching joining NATO. And so I think that probably started him on the path that he's on now in the Ukraine. For the future, just kind of watch as we get into 2025 when Saturn and Neptune both go into Aries, and they'll eventually oppose that Libra stellium. So I would imagine that's the time when Putin will finally meet his Waterloo. But I would love to hear any thoughts that you have about Putin's chart. Please put them in the comments below. And thank you for joining me for this Hellenistic challenge, and I'll plan on seeing you next week. Bye.